You are standing in your garage at 6 in the morning in the middle of February, and the water heater is making that sound again, that low mechanical groan it makes right before it gives up. You put your hand on the side of the tank, and it is barely warm. The pilot is lit, the gas is on, but the burner has been cycling for an hour, and the shower upstairs is running cold. You already know what this means. The plumber quoted you $2,800 for a new tank, $4,000 for a tankless, and looked at your propane bill on the counter and made the face plumbers make when they are about to tell you something you already suspect. You are spending somewhere between $1,800 and $2,600 a year on hot water for a family of 4, in a house insulated like a paper bag. And the whole time, on the other side of the country, there is a Mennonite man named Jacob Stoltzfus in Holmes County, Ohio, who has not paid for hot water since 1991. Not $1, not one therm of propane. He has a pile of brush and horse bedding behind his barn the size of a small school bus, and a 1/4 inch of black poly pipe wound through the inside of it. And that pile heats the water for his house, his dairy parlor, and the apartment his oldest son lives in above the workshop. For 18 months at a stretch, from one pile. I want to tell you about that pile, because the technique is not new. It is not even American in origin, and the reason you have never heard of it is not because it does not work. It is because there is no quarterly earnings report for a heap of wood chips in a field. I drove out to meet Jacob a couple of winters ago. A man I knew through a friend, a fellow who runs a small sawmill outside of Millersburg, told me I needed to go. He said it the way men out there say things when they think you are wasting your life. Drive out, meet him, bring a notebook. Jacob is in his early 60s, quiet, the kind of man who answers a question and then waits a long time before saying anything else, so you learn pretty quickly to stop filling the silence. He walked me around the back of the dairy barn, past the milk house, to a fenced area maybe 30 feet across. Inside the fence was a mound, wood chips and brush and bedding from the horse stalls, piled up taller than my head, with steam coming off the top of it in the February air. A faint, sweet, earthy smell, like a forest floor in late spring. He knelt down and pulled back a bit of the outer layer. Buried about 2 feet deep was black poly tubing, 1/2 inch agricultural grade, the kind you use for drip irrigation. He had it coiled through the pile in long horizontal loops, and the ends came out the bottom and ran underground in a buried PVC sleeve back to the house, about 90 feet away. The pile was 18 months old. It would last another 8 or 9 months before it would need to be rebuilt. The inside of that pile, 4 feet down, was holding steady at 135 degrees Fahrenheit. In February, with ice on the ground. The water coming out of that coil, going into his house, was hot enough that he had to mix it with cold at the tap. The man who figured out how to harness this was a French forester named Jean Pain. He died in 1981. He spent his life thinking about brushwood, the stuff most people burn or haul off. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, he started building enormous compost mounds out of shredded brush, running water pipe through the middle of them and capturing heat from the decomposition. He heated his home, ran a truck on the methane, and produced hot water for 18 months from a single mound. He wrote a small book about it. It was translated into English in 1980. And then, almost immediately, it was forgotten by the American mainstream. think about why. In 1980, the American home heating industry was in the middle of one of the largest equipment replacement booms in its history. The oil shocks had pushed millions of homeowners onto natural gas, propane, and electric. There was money in the equipment. There was money in the fuel. There was money in the service contracts. And there was, very specifically, no money in telling a homeowner he could heat his water for 18 months out of the brush pile at the back of his property for the cost of about $100 in poly tubing. Jeanpin's method did not get disproven, it got outspent. There was no marketing budget for a heap of wood chips. There was no trade association for piles. So the technique drifted to the margins, to the homesteaders and a handful of Mennonite and Amish farmers in Ohio and Pennsylvania who read the translation, looked at the brush they were already burning every spring and thought, well, that is interesting. Here is why it works. A compost pile generates heat through aerobic microbial decomposition. Bacteria and fungi consume the carbon in the wood chips, and as a byproduct, they release heat. A small pile, the kind most gardeners build, holds maybe 110 degrees in the center for a few weeks and cools off. A Jeanpin mound is different. It is built large enough that the outer 2 feet act as insulation for the inner core, and that core stays at 130 to 150 degrees for 12 to 18 months continuously. The mass is the battery. The mass is what makes it work. Penn State Extension published a bulletin on biological heat generation in agricultural composting in the early 1980s. Cornell did follow-up work on the thermophilic bacteria involved. Auburn looked at it as a method for heating greenhouses in the early 1990s. The research existed, the numbers checked out, the piles worked. And then the bulletins stopped being reprinted. Not because they were wrong, because the Extension Service had limited budget and there was no constituency lobbying to keep biological heat on the front page. There was, however, a very well-funded constituency lobbying to keep propane and electric water heaters on the front page. That is what your contractor learned in his certification course. Now, if you are sitting there thinking this only applies to people with 30 acres and a dairy barn, stay with me, because this next part is exactly for you. You do not need a farm. You need a space about 10 feet by 10 feet, ideally with some sun. You need shredded brushwood or wood chips, somewhere between 4 and 6 cubic yards for a small household pile, and 12 to 15 for a full-sized one. A tree service will dump chips in your driveway for free in most of the country. Call 3 of them and tell them you want a full load. 1 will say yes within a week. That is your fuel. You need about 300 feet of half-inch black polyethylene tubing, the kind used for agricultural irrigation. The cost at a farm supply store runs between $65 and $90. You need a roll of pipe insulation for the buried run between the pile and your house, 2 short brass fittings, and either a heat exchanger coil that drops into your existing water heater or a thermosiphon loop into a preheat tank that feeds your existing heater. Most people use the preheat approach because it does not require modifying the existing system. You leave the propane or electric heater exactly where it is. The pile feeds it pre-warmed water, sometimes at 110 degrees, sometimes at 130, and the existing heater only has to bring it the rest of the way up. The propane bill drops by 70 to 85%. You build the pile in layers, a bed of coarse brush about 6 inches deep for drainage. Lay your first horizontal coil of poly tubing on top, spiraling it like a flat spring. Cover with about a foot of shredded chips, wet thoroughly with a hose. Lay the next coil, cover again, wet again. Keep going until the pile is between 6 and 10 feet tall and roughly the same across. You want it dense but not packed, wet but not soaking. You let it sit for about 4 to 6 weeks before drawing heat. That is when the thermophilic bacteria take over, the core temperature climbs into the 130s, and the pile finds its equilibrium. Total cost for a household-scale pile, if you source the chips for free, runs between $120 and $180. The pile lasts 12 to 18 months before it needs to be rebuilt. When it is finished, the material inside is some of the finest compost you will ever put on a garden. The whole thing is a closed loop. The brush would have been burned or hauled to a dump. Instead, it heats your water for a year and a half, then feeds your soil for the next decade. Now here is the part Jacob did not tell me right away, the part that took 2 more visits before he mentioned it. Most people who try to build a Compost mound get mediocre results. The pile heats up for a few months and cools off. They blame the method. They tear it down, they go back to propane. The reason is almost always the chip mix. People use pure hardwood chips from a tree service, which is easiest to get. Pure hardwood is too dense and too uniform. The pile compacts, oxygen cannot reach the core, the aerobic bacteria suffocate, and anaerobic bacteria take over, which produce far less heat and a much worse smell. You need a mix. Jacob runs about 60% shredded brushwood with leaves and small branches still attached, and 40% denser chips. The brushwood keeps the pile open and breathing. The chips provide the long-burning carbon. He also adds about 10% horse bedding from his own barn, which seeds the pile with the right bacterial cultures already active. If you do not have a horse, a few wheelbarrows of finished compost from a working garden does the same job. There is one more thing, and this is the refinement Jacob mentioned almost in passing on my 3rd visit. The part the Plain community has worked out through 40 years of building these, and that you will not find in Jean Pan's original book. When you are wetting the pile during construction, charge the water with a small amount of activated biology. Some Holmes County builders use a bucket of pond water. Some use a few cups of unpasteurized whey from a dairy. Jacob uses a 5-gallon bucket of water with about a cup of his own finished compost steeped in it for 24 hours, strained, and added to the hose when he wets each layer. He says it cuts the startup time from 6 weeks to about 3 and pushes the peak core temperature 5 to 10 degrees higher. The Amish and Mennonite builders in Ohio swear by it, and they have built enough of these to know. This is one of dozens of these techniques I have been collecting from Plain community elders across Ohio and Pennsylvania over the last several years. There is a whole generation right now looking at their utility bills and their grandparents' photographs and realizing something was taken from them along the way. Not a luxury, a way of being in a house the future cannot reach into and shut off. If you want to try one of these, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what your property looks like, how much yard you have, what your winter low temperature usually is, and what you currently pay for hot water in a year. I read every one of these, and I am building a picture of where the next videos should go. And if you want to keep going on this with me, subscribe. Not because it helps the channel, because there are people doing this quiet work, and the more of us paying attention, the harder it gets for any of this to be forgotten again. Next week, I want to walk you through something I found in a 1953 USDA bulletin that I have not seen mentioned online anywhere. A method for storing fresh eggs at room temperature for 8 months without refrigeration, using a substance you can buy for about $14 at a pottery supply store. It was standard practice in American farmhouses for 60 years, and then disappeared from extension literature almost overnight in the early 1950s. I will tell you the substance, the ratio, and who lobbied to take it off the shelf. Until then, take care of the people in your house, and keep an eye on that brush pile out back. There is more heat in it than you think.